Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carrie Cullen-Hitt, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium. Thank you for joining us this morning, and my fellow host, Norwegian Energy Partners and the Norwegian Embassy, and our guests today from Equinor, Seaway 7, Aibel, and NORCE. I'm going to take a little bit of time this morning and this afternoon, depending on where you are, to talk about crossover opportunities in the offshore wind sector. Oil and gas expertise applied to offshore wind. So first, I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers this morning, and we'll speak in turn as you see folks here. And then at the end of our presentations this morning, we will be taking questions. So you're welcome to submit your questions through the Q&A button, I guess I should say, down here. If you're looking at your screen, it's down in the bottom bar. There's a Q&A format. You can submit your questions and we will collect those and direct them at the end of the presentations. I ask that if you have a person in mind for whom you'd like to direct the question, to please identify that person so we can be efficient when running through them. We do have a significant number of people joining us today, and we'll do our best to get through all of those questions. If we're unable to, we will take questions during the call, and if we're unable to them, we hope to be able to follow up in writing. And both the answers to the questions as well as the session itself is being recorded and will be made available to all of you who have registered. So thanks for joining us this morning. So again, this is Carrie Cullen-Hitt. I'm the Executive Director of the National Offshore Wind Consortium. Also joining me this morning are Siri Aspel-Kindem, who's president of Equinor Wind here in the United States, Richard Den Hollander, who's business development director of Seaway 7, Lars Ulrich, manager business development and sales from Aibel, and Randy Valstrand, who's the research director of the Norwegian Research Center AS, and Harriet Berg, who's the consul general at Norwegian Consulate General here in the United States. First, I just thought I'd take a second to talk about the consortium and our activities. The consortium is a US-based, nationally focused, not-for-profit, focused on research and development in offshore wind. We're funded by the Department of Energy, New York State Research and Development Administration, excuse me, and a number of states and other member organizations, many of whom you can see their logos and their brand names here on the side of the slide. Each of these organizations participate in the consortium, and the consortium identifies research projects and fund research projects that directly promote the development in the short term of offshore wind, as well as innovation for long-term markets and US supply chain. To date, we've run one significant solicitation with the help of NYSERDA, and we've made 20 awards. I'm not going to go through these this morning, but you can see the list of projects that have been awarded and that are underway here at the consortium. Much of this research will go towards accelerating the US supply chain, as well as the deployment of offshore wind here in the United States. And much of this information from this research and these projects will be shared publicly over the course of time as these projects unfold in the next 2 to 3 years. I did want to point out that we've had a few events this year, and this one this morning being a highlight. Excuse me, I'm going to try to get that back there quick. Being a highlight, our crossover session this morning, but also wanted to make note that later this year, in just a few weeks' time, we will be releasing an additional research and development solicitation for offshore wind projects. So please stay tuned to our website and you'll see information about that forthcoming solicitation, ideally by the end of July. So with that, I'm going to turn over the next presentation to Siri.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm very excited to be here. And both thank you to the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium for putting this event together with the Norwegian Embassy. So my name is, as mentioned previously, my name is Siri Aspel-Kindem, and I'm president of Equinor Wind US. And my responsibilities includes offshore wind portfolio throughout the US East Coast, and of course included in that is the Empire Wind, with an 860 megawatt wind project off the coast of Long Island. So I had many previous roles in Equinor, and the most recent one I had is kind of shown this kind of crossover possibilities. I was heading up an oil and gas operation north and had all the offshore assets in the Norwegian and Barents Sea. And before that, I was actually head of renewables when renewables were more in the infancy in Equinor. So I'm very enthusiastic to be here today and to talk you through the exciting offshore wind development at this start of the new industry here at the US East Coast. Okay, so at Equinor, we are actively shaping our portfolio to deliver high value with a low carbon footprint. And we are doing so by continuing to produce hydrocarbons with the world's lowest emissions. We work hard on solutions to reduce the carbon footprint for ourselves and others. And we are well on the way of developing a material and high value renewable business. And this is mainly offshore wind, and this suits well for today's topic. And my team continues to advance on this agenda and develop a value of our own unique broad energy transition. And our renewable and low carbon activities are growing from quite a small base compared to oil and gas activity. But then again, this will be the fastest growing part of Equinor in the coming years. This gives us a large potential upside, and we are positioned well. And this is an exciting learning journey lies ahead of us that will generate crossover opportunities in the offshore sector. And working in the US, as elsewhere, this is about creating the future of energy, especially in this new area, new industry in this new area. And we want to do this, not by ourselves, but together. And that means by collaborating with our key stakeholders, suppliers, and with our partners. But first of all, or last of all, I want to talk about the most important principle for us, and that's always safe. That's our number one priority. And we've been clearly reminded of this during the uncertainty and challenging time we have of COVID-19. So even though many are working from home, and we have experienced things are moving quite well, I might add that. The most important thing in all we do is the program needs to be done in a safe and efficient manner. So our strategy is value-driven and plays to our strength. We will leverage our offshore capabilities in markets we know well, like we've done in Europe, and especially in the North Sea basin, and now in the new and fast-growing industry in the US. So we build a regional offshore wind cluster to capture synergy and economy of scale, both in the development, construction, and operations. And this is very well proven by the establishment of this US wind cluster. So then we will use the unique experience with floating offshore wind to capture opportunities. For us, this is not a question of if, but when floating will be developed at scale. I will not talk more about floating today. However, by 2035, we aim to have between 12 to 16 gigawatts of renewable capacity installed globally. And that's actually 30 times bigger than the capacity we have up today. And how will we then accomplish this monumental task? Well, we have 50 years of oil and gas experience, and we have a decade in offshore wind experience. And for us, offshore wind is very much about an extension, not the step out from our traditional business. And so we do have world-class technical expertise, we are financially robust, and we are competitive at cost. And now we have the scale and capability necessary to create the value. So oil and gas and offshore wind are branches of the same tree. And just to refer to IEA, estimates that 40% of the life cycle cost of an offshore wind project have significant synergies with offshore oil and gas. Just give you some short highlights on that. Let's talk about project execution. There's a lot of similarities. We can talk about marine environment, metocean data, geotechnical surveys, There's a lot about big vessels and installation. And again, this work will need to be done safe and efficient, and which is really, again, the pillar in everything we do. A very good example is how we are now capturing these synergies in the Dogger Bank project in the UK. For the offshore substation, we are using member of the AVDC team from Johan Sverdrup, which is a kind of major oil and gas asset in Norway. So our experience has resulted in a solution that are more cost efficient than comparable offshore wind stations. And that's how we're going to continue to work, transferring competence to a project in the US portfolio, and then again helping us to build a project pipeline in the US. So we are then applying the best of Equinor. Our muscle provides efficient and flexible support across a wide range of technical and commercial disciplines. And we all know that renewables require relentless cost focus. And we will use what we can and adjust where we need to do. Of course, all this to stay competitive. And there's a lot of new technology, innovation, and digital solutions that needs to be in place. And that's as important as in oil and gas. And we are working with the same kind of toolbox. We talk about digital field workers, advanced analytics, there's condition-based monitoring and maintenance, and not the least, drone expansion, just to mention some. And we do have a long and deep relationship with many of the suppliers in both branches, like engineering, turbines, and marine operations. And then we can build on these relationships, so we can use the existing supply industry to respond to expectations on local content in this area. So my team on the US East Coast have high ambition for offshore wind. And the states and regions have announced very ambitious targets and is backed by a firm auction pipelines for the years to come. And we have successfully established a strategic foothold on the eastern seaboard. So far, we have access to high quality leases offshore New York and Massachusetts with a combined potential of 4.5 gigawatts. And we think the US system presents high optionality. Our project can compete for offtake in different states. So Empire Wind is really our flagship project in the US. And for Empire, we have secured a competitive offtake contract in New York, and we are now scaling up the project team to mature this project even further. And we're now settling up developing the first 800-ish megawatts, which is around 40% of the total lease potential. And we are positioning then also the remaining potential in the Empire lease for future offtake auctions. And this is a project that's located on shallow water, close to shore, and this combination of its location and its excellent wind resource make it a very attractive piece of an offshore asset. So this is exciting time for the US East Coast team. And I'm very much looking forward to the upcoming major milestones when we have for the coming of this project. So then I will close with a happy announcement that happened just a couple of weeks ago. I'm happy to introduce our newest project, the Beacon Wind, the new name of our Massachusetts lease. When complete, the Beacon Wind will provide renewable and reliable power to more than 1 million households in Northeast. So we are at the pivotal moment of the offshore wind industry, and this project builds on the region momentum to bring offshore wind energy to the Northeast household. So I'm very passionate about the industry potential and looking forward to advancing Equinor's leadership in the US. Then I end by closing this session by saying another thanks to the Norwegian Embassy and the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium for the opportunity to speak to you and encourage any question you might have. And then I will leave the word to Richard Den Hollander, Seaway 7 Business Development Director. So please.
Thank you, Siri, for the nice words. And I will also want to thank the organization and especially also NORWEP who invited me for this call. I'm not sure whether I have control now over my presentation because I didn't see the presentation of Equinor just before. I just start, well, Seaway 7 is part of Subsea 7. The crossover we started 10 years ago. In 2009, actually, we started to build our business into the offshore wind, from oil and gas, 30 years oil and gas into into the wind, in the offshore wind. So the crossover is really happening within the company. It's also part of the strategy of Subsea 7. So that's why Subsea 7 bought our company 3 years ago, and some other offshore wind services as well in the company. So we're growing fast in that direction, using our expertise from oil and gas. Just to make sure, is everybody seeing the presentation? Because I don't see it on my screen.
Yes.
Richard, I can see it. If you want to just prompt me, say next slide, I'll be happy to change on your behalf.
Okay, well, so I don't have the control myself, I understand.
If you can see it, you can control it. But if you can't,
I don't see it, no. Okay. So let me get my slides on my screen then. Okay, the first slide I want to show you is the introduction. That's about Seaway 7. That's the renewables business unit of Subsea 7, as I've just explained. On this picture, you see the services, actually what we are doing in the oil and gas, similar to what we do now in the renewables since 10 years. The crossover also for our company was 10 years ago, it was 100% for Seaway 7, 100% oil and gas in the revenues. And now it's up to 95% renewables in 1 decade, so it goes very fast. If you can go to the next slide, Jürgen. So the next slide shows also a bit of the introduction explained before. We moved from oil and gas into renewables for the Seaway 7 group, part of Subsea 7. Started in 91, first oil and gas, and now still oil and gas, but a very small portion in our own company. But we make use of the Subsea 7 group for future purposes also in the renewables. I'll show you that later. So next slide, please, Jürgen. Because, you know, what we see, everything started the same. Also, you know, oil and gas started onshore and then near shore and then further offshore to shallow waters and later on even further to the deeper waters. The same you will see happening and is happening in renewables, in the offshore wind. It started offshore, onshore, near shore, shallow water, in the future floating wind, deeper waters. Exactly the same process, only at a higher pace. It's going very fast with the turbines getting very big very quickly. But we make use of the expertise we build up in renewables, like a lot of our peers do. Learned a lot, take a lot from oil and gas in the future. There's still a lot of opportunities to, and challenges of course, but we have a lot of opportunities to gain from oil and gas. Next slide, please. So you see here in the 60s, 70s oil and gas offshore. Well, all the methods used at that time, decades later, they use the same methods you see here in the early phase of offshore wind. The techniques and technologies are used. Nowadays it's improved and getting and faster, and also of course safety is a very important part of our business. So it's safe and faster. So safety doesn't mean it's slower or more expensive. Actually, I believe it's more economic because you think more. Next slide, please, Jürgen. So the next slide, you see the type of work. The type of work we have experienced in oil and gas over the decades we work in oil and gas is not much difference. There are challenges, of course, but if you see the substations are similar to oil and gas platforms, also the same for transportation, installation, design, probably a bit different. But the jackets and foundations are similar to what we are used to do. Also, the cable laying is similar to, but the projects are bigger. It's a more repetition. It's more planning. It's logistics. There's a lot of challenge. So that's the main difference, I think. In the next slide, Jürgen. Yeah, I made some bullet points here about differences. I can talk about every part, but the main differences we see, and there are many more, it's the politics and support systems is different than oil and gas. Politics are very important to get people with you because it's often near shore. There are a lot of other communities trying to use the field, and the fields are big, so multiple use of the field, that's always an issue. And also the support systems, you know, the subsidies, etc., is all public money, so you need the public as well. So politics is different. Environmental impact, as I said, is bigger. It's in some countries is different. For example, now we're talking about the US, issues like whale migration, non-piling during night, seasons you cannot drive piles, the soils with they call it ancient grounds, you know, where ancestors are buried in the past. You're not able to touch the floor without investigations. So, for example, anchoring of vessels is an issue in these soils. It's different than elsewhere. Yeah, in general, it's not only the US, but in general, renewables clients are not necessary, but you have different clients coming from onshore. Powerhouses, banks, other type of developers, other than oil and gas companies. Of course, you see now a crossover, oil companies going into renewables. You see Equinor is, well, Statoil before, now Equinor is one of the companies paving the road for I think the other companies to cross over, like Shell and Total. They're also very active at the moment. Project size, yeah, as I mentioned before, is huge. It's multiple serial production, logistics. You need to be able to carry out logistics elsewhere in the world, like areas not developed yet, like the northeast of the US is different than south of US. US in South and Gulf of Mexico, they've established industry. Northeast, not yet there. And you need a horizon, of course, to be able to invest in the infrastructure. That will come, but it takes time. And I know from other countries as well. You know, some countries have established a logistic basis and infrastructure. Many countries don't. And the execution, as I mentioned before, the serial production, you know, that is with different interface to manage, and large projects to cover multiple seasons. So differences are there, but you can handle it. But the industry or the local industry needs to be equipped in the future, and there's a lot to be done. And we can help with that. Next slide, please, Jürgen, about challenges and opportunities. For example, if you want to do investments, as I touched on earlier, when do we and what do we invest in? Yeah, you need a horizon, and it's often sensitive to that's what we've seen now also with one of the developments being delayed because the environmental impact, the cumulative environmental impact had to be taken care of by BOEM. Hopefully that will work out, but it delayed the job for 2 years, and that doesn't give investors or contractors like us the certainty to invest in new high capital equipment, and that also accounts for local yards, etc. Interfaces is with authorities like different cabotage laws and local laws you have to take care of, unions, etc. Supply chain, local requirements, critical path of key equipment. Long before you start a project, you need to have the certainty that for example, you can invest in those high capex equipment. And the execution phase is very short in the US because of some bans in operations. And of course, that will change, I think, in future when techniques are developing and there are techniques coming that you may be able to drive during night and also go through the winter season when it's banned, and protecting the environment in the same time. Project schedule, yeah, limited working periods, as I mentioned. Well, globalization, that's a point not necessarily for US, but that is for the total workforce worldwide an issue, because there's a lot of sailing to be done instead of working. So there's also an opportunity to develop something in the US. Avoiding these big transits, like constructing monopiles, transition pieces, marshalling yards, etc. Well, the execution risks, local requirements, improving techniques, like large piles and drilling issues needs to be solved in the future. It's not, it's being offered but not yet proved. So who's taking the risks? Coming to the terms and conditions. You know, from oil and gas, we are very known with the terms and conditions of our clients. And the new industry has other terms and conditions. And you have to work through that as well. Next slide, please. I'm almost finished. 10 minutes are almost over. The next slide is about future and crossover. We think it continues for many decades for both bottom fixed as well as floating wind. Floating wind is very interesting, I think. Well, you see, as I mentioned, intensified crossovers interest from the oil majors at the moment. You see that coming up. Maybe it has to do with low oil price as well at the moment. And also going to the future. I mean, this is the future. Sustainability and clean energy. That's what I believe. And market globalizes. That's also for bottom fixed an issue. Larger turbines, of course, going very quick. When we started, it was 4 megawatt, and now I think we're now offering the 14.7 megawatt, huge turbines. So almost at one location, almost 3 or 4 turbines from the past. Yeah, and also very large projects with multi-gigawatt of developments maybe not yet but also in the US. You see some coming as well. In the Dominion is is an example. Huge development. Larger structures because of the turbines, water depth, soil type. You know, you get different type of foundations, gravity bases, jackets, monopiles, and from the large monopiles to the XXX monopiles at the moment. And further offshore, that's also going. And then when we go to the next step, that's even for the deeper waters, then floating wind will become an interesting part. You see some pictures at the bottom. That's very clearly from left to right. It's moving from oil and gas, similar techniques and operations towards the renewables, deep water. On the bottom right side, you see Highway Tampen, and that's in Norway. It's a project. We are, that's an off-grid. We call it an off-grid development, powering oil and gas fields. That's also future over there. Deep water using the methods from the past in oil and gas, but also new methods are developed because serial production requires R&D to improve production offshore and safe, of course. And again at the bottom, also here serial construction opposed to one-offs in oil and gas, and that's the biggest difference in my opinion, the serial construction offshore. So with this last slide, I'm sure there will be questions. I'm happy to answer, of course. And with this last slide, I want to thank the organization again, and I want to give the floor to Lars Henrik of Aibel. Good luck, and speak to you soon. Bye.
Thank you for that, Richard, and thank you for having me here at this webinar. My name is Lars Henrik Hosøy, and I'm responsible for the business development and sales organization within Offshore Wind in Aibel. In my presentation, I will talk about the crossover experiences that we have from oil and gas to offshore wind, I will touch on some key differences and end with some of our thoughts related to floating wind as well. I'm not sure if it is, yes, hopefully you can still see my presentation. I have just included this slide to give a short background piece of who we are and what we are focusing on, so you can relate to this when I'm going through our crossover experience. And we have been working as an EPC and service provider within oil and gas for decades now. And we started focusing on offshore wind around 2010. And just to make that clear, the offshore wind activities that we have today will not substitute our oil and gas activities, but it's an important and valuable supplement to also diversify and strengthen our business. And briefly on the bottom fixed wind, we are focusing primarily on the transmission side, on HVDC projects and AC solutions. And on floating wind, we are also, in addition to the substation, also focusing on the floating foundation itself. Now it shifted on my screen. When talking about crossover from oil and gas to offshore wind, we need to look at the relevant experience. And we see that we can use a lot of experience that we have from the oil and gas industry and utilize that for the offshore wind industry. And for our scope on the platform side, we are not the ones that are developing or producing the primary technology for the function of these platforms, but we are taking the role as an EPC. We can build the structural part and the top sides at our yards and so on. But as you can see on the pictures to the right, even though you shift the primary technology going into the top side, there is a lot of similarities in terms of executing a complete EPC of an oil and gas project that you can see on the picture at the bottom. And then offshore wind substation, as you can see on the picture on the top there. So for us, the ability to develop and build a platform solution that can support this primary technology is key and very important. And we need to use our ability to understand and develop a combined project solution for these kind of projects. Both the oil and gas industry and offshore wind have large and complex projects. It has been mentioned by the previous speakers as well. And both industries have installation in challenging marine environments, and including the heavy lift operation and the offshore works. And we have a similar strong focus on HSE and compliance in offshore wind as we have in oil and gas. And of course, it's still extremely important to develop cost-optimal solutions going forward in this industry, and we have seen a rapid development in cost reductions in the industry so far. The different, now I think it jumped 2 slides, so we need to go back a slide. We have some different characteristics between oil and gas and offshore wind. And based on the last 10 years, we have gained a lot of experience related to these kind of projects as well. And what we see is that you have, to some extent, contractually less balanced projects in offshore wind than what we are used to when taking the role as an EPC in the oil and gas, which has been important to get control of, and that especially when it comes to liabilities, the EPC role and extent of responsibilities for third parties. And also we have some longer warranty periods that you need to take into account typically in these kind of projects. It's still an emerging market. You have new technologies, and talking about HVDC, even though we have seen 10+ projects being executed or are in execution today within HVDC. It's still new in a lot of the geographical markets other than Germany, meaning that both our clients and the supply chain, of course, have a steep learning curve throughout the project as we are paving the way in this market together with the rest of the supply chain. So that's an important step for us to take. To some extent, we also see an increased risk exposure, and the strong focus on cost, which is obvious and similar to the oil and gas industry. We also see in combination with a lot of use of lump sum contracts in these markets, which is of course having a different mechanisms on how we need to execute these kind of projects going forward. Now I'm going to relate some of these experiences to also look at the market for floating wind. And for floating wind, we still have a lot of aspects to cover in order to reach a commercial level. And here we have listed up some thoughts that we have identified and are focusing on in order to support the development of floating wind. One of the aspects is the fabrication capacity in the supply chain and the capabilities that needs to be established. And the weight and size of the floating substructures require a significant amount of fabrication capacity. And it was mentioned by Richard as well with the serial production, which we see is a key and important part of commercializing floating wind. But we also see that we cannot necessarily compare it exactly to what has been done in the car industry, for instance. But you still need to have a significant amount of serial production in order to support reaching that commercial stage. We also see that we have some discussions related to incremental development versus disruptive. When going from bottom fixed to floating wind in a commercial stage, we are asking ourselves, will we have a situation where we will see these traditional one tower solutions or one turbine solutions as the main preferred solutions, or will we at some point in time see some disruptive concepts going forward? Important and interesting questions to be answered. We also see that developers' purchase pattern is challenging and needs to be solved for floating wind, because we have two different setups primarily. You can have concept competitions with fixed supply chains, or you can have situations where we have selected concepts with the developers having several contenders competing for that concept. And also the capacity constraints and how we handle those and manage those for floating foundation is important to work on going forward. And you can end up in a chicken and egg discussion where the EPC contractor will be having challenges to invest in the necessary construction capacity for commercial scale floating wind farm without having a contract, and a developer will be potentially reluctant to go forward without having the comfort of that capacity in the supply chain prior to awarding those contracts. So all of these are questions and items that we need to work on together with the entire supply chain to make sure that we take the necessary steps going forward for floating wind. To summarize my presentation, I would also like to make an important remark. As I've been through now, we are utilizing a lot of the experience that we have from oil and gas to offshore wind projects that we are executing. But we also see an interesting fact that we are actually also seeing transfer of experiences from offshore wind projects to the oil and gas projects that we are also doing. So we are having lessons learned actually going both ways between industries, and that's a position where you can benefit from both industries, and a valuable element on our end. Now I will end with thanking everyone for listening in, and thank you for having me. And I would like to turn the word over to Randi Valestrand in NORCE.
Yes, hello. Yeah, so I am Randi Valestrand. I'm a research director in the Research Institute in NORCE, and I come from the department NORCE Energy. And I will talk about research opportunities to apply oil and gas research within offshore wind application. So first of all, I just want to say that within NORCE, we cover a large area of research connected to offshore wind. We have energy department, technology, society, environmental and climate department working on these issues on very various scale. So this is illustrated on this picture. And also I see that other people have been talking about the difference between oil and gas and offshore wind. To me, as a physicist, it's a bit different. Of course, we see that both are large systems where a lot comes into play. But for me, I think of oil and gas, then I think the main challenge is that we can never inspect the reservoir because it's way below ground. But for oil and for offshore wind, we can actually inspect. It's above ground, all of it. And then a negative thing with the oil and gas is that we cannot control. A positive thing is that we can control the dynamical impact. So it's basically a static system if we don't do anything to it. Of course, with offshore wind, it's much harder. Here we have the weather and ocean and all the earth dynamics that we cannot control. Also, I see that the need for digital tools is very similar in both of these applications. And also, of course, this is very important that both require interdisciplinary knowledge. So I'm going to talk about a little story on how our research has contributed to a worldwide paradigm shift in oil and gas reservoir management, and also draw some lines on how I see that this can be transferred to offshore wind. So this paradigm shift started with Geir Evensen publishing in 1994 a paper on ensemble-based data assimilation method called Ensemble-Kalman filter. And Geir Evensen works as chief scientist in my group in NORCE today. So basically, this method, the ensemble-based methods, are used in all weather services today. And here you see the weather forecast for Bergen, my city in Norway. And we are given the forecast in a probabilistic way. And I tried to find a similar curve for America, but I didn't find exactly the same. But I found this map here with likely and chance. And so it's kind of a probability map also. So people are used to thinking about future thing in a probabilistic manner. And that was very good when we initiated this for history matching for oil and gas. So we started this in 2000, and we have published very many significant papers, and we have demonstrated the value in international open benchmark competitions, and of course had a lot of projects and highly cited. So it has led to a multidisciplinary and multi-realization reservoir modeling tool that is used worldwide. And since Equinor is with us, I can say that Equinor is using this, and it's called Fast Model Update inside Equinor. And it's also commercialized via an independent company. So what we address is digitalization, big data, big models. And we do everything in an ensemble mode. So what do I mean about an ensemble mode? That I'm going to explain now. So basically, when we do that, we don't use one model for the fluid flow in the reservoir. We use many fluid models. We use an ensemble of models, typically 100 or more, to cover the uncertainty, because we are uncertain of how it really looks. And then we have data. We have production data, for instance, and the blue lines here are the 100 models and how they cover the data for this oil production curve rate. And then what we do, we update all the models, the ensemble of models, by using all the uncertain observations we have. That can be production data, seismic data, well log data, you name it. We use everything and we update millions of uncertain parameters in the reservoir. And then we have, when we have performed the updating, we have a set of models that we believe is better in predicting the future. So then we predict the future and we have an uncertainty span. We can also optimize with an ensemble of models. When we do the optimization, we have to define a value function. So in oil and gas, it can be the money of oil minus all the costs you have. And then you optimize this function based on drainage strategy, placement of well, numbers of wells and drilling order. And this could easily be a number of windmills and where you put them and everything. So it's easy to transfer. And what we have at the end here then is that we include the realistic uncertainty of the reservoir when future scenarios are evaluated. So this is to improve and ease decision making. So for instance, water rate with 3 different scenarios given with uncertainty. And then in oil and gas, we repeat the big loop because sometimes we need to change the geo models, geostatistical models, and start from the beginning again. And why is this so well received in the oil and gas business? It is because you are able to include the uncertainty along all the steps in the big loop of your workflow. So this is basically why it's picked up and used everywhere. And the uncertainty is realistic. So how can we transfer this to offshore wind? Well, first of all, I see that we can build an ensemble of site models to cover the model uncertainty. And then we can, of course, build an ensemble of wake models to cover that model uncertainty. And we are already receiving the weather and ocean models as an ensemble. So this fits perfectly. And then we can optimize wind farm layout by using petroleum industry reservoir modeling software for site characterization by using an ensemble of models. We can connect it to an ensemble of wind condition models. We can have an ensemble of cable layout for site models, ensemble of anchoring positions, of floating parks. And by doing this and including all the uncertainty, we are safer. It will lead to more cost-efficient solutions and low carbon installation solutions. And of course, when it comes to updating the models under an ensemble mode, we can update the wake models continuously as we receive more weather data. We can also update strain, stress, and torque models for wear control and maintenance planning for each of the windmills. When everything is under operations, we also can optimize the turbine operation for changing wind conditions. So basically, when you have bottom fixed, you can steer it, rotate the windmills so it's up against the wind before the wind turns. And then when it comes to floating turbines, you will rotate and move in the vertical direction. So this you can optimize to be ahead of the weather, basically. So this will include realistic uncertainty in a big loop workflow for offshore wind. And of course, it's interdisciplinary knowledge. When everybody uses the same framework, it's very positive. So by that, I want to say thank you for inviting me to give this talk, especially to NORWEP and the organizer and everybody who listened. And I give the word back to Harriet Berg.
Thank you, Randi, and thank you to all the speakers for sharing their experience. And a big thank you to the consortium to organizing this. I think it's really interesting to look at the similarities and the differences in the different areas that we are looking at here. US offshore wind is growing rapidly, but faces many challenges needed to be solved swiftly if these ambitious state renewable targets are to be met. Luckily, we're not starting from scratch. Many solutions already exist, as we've been seeing, and they are well proven in the oil and gas and maritime industry. Solutions for digitalization of offshore operations, subsea technology, floating installations, heavy lift vessels, and how to deal with large projects, safety, compliance are all important examples. Our Norwegian ocean industry experience offers many of the solutions needed for the offshore wind to succeed in the US. And I'm thrilled to see the cooperation that we are experiencing these days between US and American companies. So I'm grateful for the opportunity this webinar provides to showcase some specific solutions and areas for further cooperation. And with this, I hand the floor back to Carrie and look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Harriet. So we do have a few questions. I thought I'd get us started with one of them. One is somewhat of a fundamental question, but it might be useful for many of our listeners today. And I think, Richard, why don't we start with you with this one, and perhaps Lars may want to tag on after. What water depth is the transition typically made from fixed to floating systems and structures? So really, when do you start to go, from using a fixed system to floating? And then a follow-on question to that, which is sort of my own, is when you think about that, where does this crossover occur the most from a fixed and floating perspective? Do you see more opportunities in floating for crossover from oil and gas, or is it kind of equal between the two types of systems? And Richard, I'll turn it over to you to answer.
I think the first question about water depths, at the moment you see the bottom fixed world somewhere around 50 to 60 meters. So that's about, 200 feet, roughly, max. But you also see now constructions floating wind for also less water depth from 40 meters, but that is not economic if the soil permits the foundations now available, like monopiles or jackets. So I think above 60 meters you have to think about floating wind. That's a bit of the difference. With respect to the crossover part from oil and gas compared to bottom fixed to floating wind, more or less similar, I think. But it's a different. It's also in the oil and gas is different. I mean, the deeper water is different industry than the shallow water, and you need a lot of barges, tugs, and vessels to construct a field, but also to maintain the field. That's also in oil and gas. The only thing is it's much bigger because the fields are bigger. So it's a bit similar crossover. You're on mute.
I'm on mute, thank you. So I'll move on to our next question, and I think I'm going to direct this one to Siri and Lars, and maybe we'll start with you, Lars, and then turn it over to Siri, which is sort of a broader question. Do you feel that the health and safety culture in the offshore wind industry is as strong as it is in oil and gas? and how do we promote that or encourage that? Lars, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I can start with that. And the easy question is yes. I feel it's a similar strong focus on health and safety within offshore wind as in oil and gas, and I also think it should be that way. We are doing a lot of operations offshore in harsh environments, which is also challenging in both industries. I think it's important to continue to promote it, and I think it's also important to take into account that within offshore wind, and especially on the turbine installation side, you have a lot of repeat installations, and then you need to be particularly aware of these aspects and the importance of HSE when you do same operations over and over again, and maintain that strong focus on HSE.
Well, a comment from my side, and thank you for asking. This is something that's extremely important for us because we don't want to hurt anybody working for us in oil and gas or offshore wind. I think it's a bit twofold. I think every time you start a new industry, you have to be a bit cautious, and this is a new marine environment. So I must say, I think oil and gas industry has a very strong HSE culture and need to build on that. Never said, you know, the oil and gas was perfect, but then again, it comes along with a long experience. So I think this is something we can bring along into the US East Coast when we are building an industry. And of course, we will work with a lot of suppliers that we are quite familiar with. And then we also will have to work with some suppliers that are new for us. That's very good because it's going to be a new industry. And then we have to work on ensuring that we have the HSE standard that we like to have. And then again, I repeat, we don't want to hurt anybody for working from us.
So much, Siri. Okay, let's see. Maybe I'll direct this one to Randy at NORCE. Sort of a broad question about applicability for environmental kind of concerns and how your organization, do you assess those? Do the tools that you have assess? I think you referred to kind of the space as a reservoir. Do you have tools that assess that? Is that incorporated into the work that you do? And what do you see maybe the differences are between oil and gas and offshore wind in this area?
Yeah, we do have tools, and we are starting to develop them a lot. And especially we are connection to the environmental department when we develop these tools further, because the reservoir we are talking about here is very close to the sea bottom. It's actually very different. It's not like kilometers from the aquaculture. And so that is the main difference. And also all these things that come into aspect, for instance, the wildlife in sea, but also especially the bird safety. This we will handle, and we will use social scientists, environmentalists, and to do this.
Very good, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on kind of maybe similarities or differences with oil and gas from offshore wind? Siri?
Okay. Yeah, I saw it was a very good question regarding, you know, what can you take back? And again, we have talked about the ways we can take technology, you know, project executions. We talk about the repetitiveness of this industry. And I think there's a lot of things we can take back again to the oil and gas. And I think especially on digitalization, I see that the offshore wind is quite, you know, far ahead. We know there's big control rooms being built. There's a lot of, you know, the offshore workers, you know, in Europe, they actually have a pad from the startup. And these are things that are coming to the oil and gas. And I see that on digitalization and the use of, you know, analytics, advanced analytics, and then again, it goes back to the condition-based monitoring, also maintenance. So I think there's a lot of things that gone back from the offshore wind and also back to the oil and gas industry, which is good.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
I can add something to that. You know, we look indeed in the past when we started 10 years ago in the renewables, we were listening in a lot of conferences about lessons from oil and gas. And I think 5 years later, we had conferences that oil and gas is learning from renewables. And in the execution, indeed, it's a new industry with a lot of new people and new techniques and developing quickly, evolving as well. So what you see in operations, for example, with maintenance, etc., you have now systems with vessels very high workability, with high seas working offshore, without moving parts. You know that's a big development. It was already with oil and gas, but it evolved big time during the renewables business, because maintenance offshore, bringing people offshore, keeping the health correct, and also the environment they work in, having a comfortable transfer, etc., and safe. That is improved big time, and that's evolved from oil and gas, but we learned from it in oil and gas as well. So there's a lot of issues, a lot of things can be learned also the other way around, for sure. You're on mute, Kari.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's interesting that you point out it's somewhat of an iterative process, right? Where renewables is learning from oil and gas, and maybe vice versa too, as innovation starts to grab root in the offshore wind space. Maybe this is for Richard and Lars, but others can chime in as well. We've had some questions about vessels and using existing vessels or innovation that are needed in the US to accommodate both fixed and floating, both installation, but as well as O&M. And what needs to happen here in the US to be able to make that transition, and keeping in mind, of course, we have the Jones Act. So maybe Lars, we'll start with you, or Richard, either one.
Lars, please.
Yeah, it's a broad question, and I can try to answer part of it. From our side, the scope as I presented on bottom fixed, it's related to the offshore substations, which will be one lift operation. Of course, if you build it in modules or box solutions, you can have several lifts, but it's going to be one installation. And what we see now, when you come up to the sizes that we are talking about and the ways we are talking about, then it's challenging because you don't have a Jones Act compliant vessel to install. So one alternative solution can be, as you mentioned in your question, that we can support the development of a US compliant or a Jones Act compliant vessel. But other solutions could also be to have other installation methods as well for the substations. For instance, you can use gravity-based structures, as we are doing on one of the projects we are executing now, where you can remove the need of such a installation vessel for the substation and tow it out with tugboats. It's self-floating until you install it. So that's a potential solution. So yeah, that's my part response to the question.
Richard?
Just to answer this, I think referring to Jones Act compliance, etc. It's transportation from A to B within the States. We are used to work, and many of our contenders as well, or competition as well, used to work in the US. So we can work with Jones Act compliant vessels. So we use our own vessel and then use the Jones Act compliant in transportation spread towards our vessel offshore. That's a work that's proven for many decades in the Gulf of Mexico. It works. There's no Jones Act compliant vessel in oil and gas heavy lift vessel. So for more than 60 years, never one has been built. And the thing is with a new build, of course we are thinking about it, but we needs to be economic. And if we build something in the US, we need a horizon with volume before you build such a thing. And we've done investigations in building it in the US. The price is quite high for building new vessels in the US. So you need that US market, because you cannot sell it outside the US because it's too expensive. Economics doesn't work. That's in short, you know, we don't see an issue with Jones and compliance at the moment. I know there is an issue with the jackup, the installation of, let's say, the turbines, because they are used to use jackups offshore, and then you have to shuttle your vessel in and out to pick up your equipment, and then you're transporting in the States, and then you're not Jones Act compliant. And there are now solutions on the drawing board solving those. We're also involved in one of them, which I cannot explore here, but there are solutions also for that purpose. But the main reason is turbine installation with jackup vessels. That is an issue to be solved.
Okay, thank you. I have two more questions. The first I'm going to direct at Randy, and then our last question I'll send over to Siri. So let me start with the question for you, Randy. And it's a bit, I'm going to read it because it's, I think, easier for me to do it that way. With wind farms moving to deeper waters, are there specific imaging challenges that you face in terms of collecting underwater site data? And what kind of imaging innovations are you looking for that might improve your geomodeling and ethic site characterizations?
No, I mean, we are currently using for oil and gas. We of course use 4D seismic extensively, but this is not maybe necessary for the offshore wind installations because you don't have to dig that deep. But you could do, of course, when you consider anchoring and these kind of things. You have to know, and the cabling, of course, you have to know that you can tie them to a good conditioning ground at sea. But we have tools to do this, to monitor these conditions, both on very high water and also for shallower water. So that was the first part of the question, and then there was the second one, I think.
Just to add to that, what imaging innovations are you looking for or are you pursuing? And are they needed?
Now, we haven't thought about any new techniques that is especially for offshore wind. Okay.
So pretty much you can use, from your perspective at the moment anyway, what's been developed for oil and gas works quite well, or you know, for offshore wind is transferable.
Yeah, that's my opinion.
Yeah. Okay, and Siri, I'll direct the last question to you if you don't mind. And this is more about workforce and thinking through how I'm trying to paraphrase the question, so I apologize, but really how, from a developer's perspective, are you planning your workforce for installation and O&M, although it's, you know, a ways out in time? You know, are you already thinking about whether or not you have people onshore? Do they live offshore? And the partners that you might use, you know, to help do that work?
Good questions, and I you know, won't be anything specific because these are the concept we are still discussing, of course. But then again, you know, I could just refer to how we use this and how we do this in the UK. And there we are doing both. We have this kind of personal transport, CTVs, that transport people out to the field and back on a daily basis. And that again, then you have to be near the shore. If you're longer for shore, you will typically have this kind of service operating vessels being standby. And then they could either go back and change crew, or they could do and also these transport vessels, boats could also go back and forth. So I think there's many ways of doing it, and that will be definitely dependent on the you know, the distance from shore. And as you know, the leases we have and the project we have have somewhat a distance to shore. And then where you will have a kind of combination, then potentially people could actually sleep on the boat. So that's kind of the solution we can foresee. And then we will, of course, then set up, you know, a base where we can run the operation from. And then again, also we will have control room that we can monitor. And then again, when I'm talking about the technology, and you understand I'm a bit of a technology geek, the technology we can also incorporate in these kind of control rooms to ensure that we get the most out of these wind farms, you know, in the future. So I'm not sure if I responded directly to your question, but at least, you know, and then again, we all know there's expectation of local content. And of course, this is part of the response that we have to do as well, as part of development, both on the development construction, but not at least also in the operations phase.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I do think you answered the question. So, you know, and obviously this is an evolving challenge or thing to think about, as many of these things are. So with that, I think I will close our webinar this morning and this afternoon by thanking all of our presenters. Thank you so much. As a reminder to our participants, a thank you to you as well. You can still submit questions. We're trying to answer those in writing as well if we missed them today. And we will have a recording and brief responses to those questions available as well that should be sent out through the mass email system, I believe sometime, if not today, later this week, certainly before the end of the week. But thank you again to my co-sponsors, Norwegian Energy Partners in the Norwegian Embassy. Thank you so much. And to our speakers from Equinor, Seaway, Aibel, and NORCE. Very helpful, and look forward to working with everyone soon. Have a great day.